October 15th, 2023. Margaret Chen had 48 hours to live. Harrison Ford had just walked into her hospice room. 3 million people had watched her son's viral video, begging for this moment. Ford took her hand, smiled that crooked smile, and said the words every fan dreams of hearing. Then Margaret leaned close and whispered 6 words that changed everything. "I saw what happened to Danny." Ford's hand went cold. His eyes darted to the door. Because Danny Morrison had died in a stunt accident 41 years ago, and the studio had paid millions to bury the truth. But Margaret Chen had been there. She'd been watching from the shadows, and now she was dying with Hollywood's deadliest secret. The room had suddenly become very quiet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen watched Harrison Ford's face drain of color, the transformation so complete she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The morphine made everything feel distant, like watching a movie through frosted glass, but this moment cut through the haze with crystal clarity. Ford's famous hand, the one that had wielded lightsabers and whips, trembled slightly as he released hers. He glanced toward the door of the sterile hospice room, then back at her gaunt face. Margaret could practically see the calculations running behind those intelligent eyes. How much did she know? How much could she prove? And most importantly, who else knew? "I'm sorry," he said carefully, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure what you mean." Margaret's laugh came out as a wheeze that made her oxygen tank hiss in response. Even dying, she recognized a performance when she saw one. After 45 years in Hollywood, coordinating stunts for everyone from Bruce Willis to Sigourney Weaver, she'd seen plenty of actors try to sell lies. Ford was better than most, but not good enough. "Danny Morrison," she repeated, watching him flinch. "Stunt double. Temple of Doom prep work, 1982. Fell from a 40-foot rig during a whip sequence test. Broke his neck." She paused, letting the silence stretch. Except he didn't fall, did he? The machines around her bed beeped steadily, marking time like a countdown. Through the window, Los Angeles sprawled under an October haze, the same city where she'd spent decades making dangerous things look effortless. Now she was the one in danger, and there was nothing effortless about dying. Ford sat down heavily in the vinyl chair beside her bed, the same chair where her son David had spent countless hours over the past month, reading her get-well cards from strangers and updating her on the viral video's climbing view count. 3.2 million and counting, he'd said that morning, his eyes bright with the kind of hope she'd stopped feeling weeks ago. "Margaret," Ford said, and she was surprised by the genuine exhaustion in his voice. "You don't understand what you're talking about. Danny's accident was investigated. The studio, the union, OSHA, everyone looked into it. Everyone who mattered got paid to look the other way." Margaret's words came out stronger than she felt. "I was there, Harrison. Second unit coordinator for the stunt prep. Fresh out of film school, eager to prove myself. I saw Jonas Kellerman arguing with Danny right before the test run." Ford went very still. Margaret had dropped the name she'd been saving for 41 years, the name that turned a tragic accident into something much darker. Jonas Kellerman, legendary stunt coordinator, mentor to half the action stars in Hollywood, and the man who'd handpicked Harrison Ford for his breakthrough role after Danny Morrison died. "You're hallucinating," Ford said, but his voice lacked conviction. The medication makes me forget what I had for breakfast," Margaret interrupted. "It doesn't make me forget watching Jonas cut Danny's safety line." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ford's face had gone from pale to ashen, and Margaret realized she might have just made a terrible mistake. For weeks she'd planned this moment, imagining how she'd finally unburden herself to the man who'd unknowingly built his career on another man's murder. She'd pictured relief, maybe even gratitude. She hadn't expected to see fear in Harrison Ford's eyes, fear of her. "Why now?" he asked finally. "Why tell me this now?" Margaret looked at her hands, age-spotted and thin, the 4-line taped to her wrist like a tether to a world she was already leaving. "Because I'm dying, and Danny deserves the truth. And because—" She met his eyes again. Because I think you deserve to know what really happened." Outside her room, she could hear the familiar sounds of the hospice. Nurses' quiet conversations, the squeak of wheelchair wheels, someone's television playing an old movie. Normal sounds of a place where people came to die peacefully, but peace felt very far away now. Ford stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. His reflection in the glass looked older than his 78 years, and Margaret wondered if he'd been carrying the weight of suspicion all this time, if some part of him had always questioned the convenient timing of Danny's death and his own sudden elevation to leading man status. "Jonas is dead," he said without turning around. "Has been for 15 years. Jonas didn't work alone." Margaret's voice was getting weaker, but her resolve was strengthening. The studio covered it up. Executive named William Hartley signed off on the accident report. "He's very much alive, very much still powerful, and very much still protecting that secret." Ford turned back to her, and Margaret saw something new in his expression, not just fear now, but understanding. He was beginning to grasp that this wasn't just about the past. This was about right now, about what happened to people who threatened to expose 40-year-old murders involving men who still controlled empires. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I think we may both be in trouble." The silence that followed Ford's words seemed to stretch beyond the confines of Margaret's small hospice room, expanding into something vast and dangerous. Margaret felt it settle over them like a shroud, and for the first time since her diagnosis, she was afraid of something other than dying. She studied Ford's face in the amber light filtering through the Venetian blinds. The late afternoon sun carved deep shadows across his features, making him look like a character from one of his own films. The reluctant hero who just realized the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. But this wasn't a movie, and there would be no stunt coordinators to keep them safe. "Tell me about your son," Ford said suddenly, his voice gentle but urgent. He'd moved away from the window and was standing near the foot of her bed, his hands gripping the metal rail. "David, right? The one who made the video." The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. In her pain-fogged determination to finally tell the truth about Danny Morrison, she'd been thinking about justice, about setting the record straight before she died. She hadn't been thinking about David, sweet, devoted David, who brought her crossword puzzles and read her stories from the entertainment blogs about celebrities responding to her viral wish. David, who worked as a high school history teacher and had never hurt anyone in his life. "He doesn't know," she whispered, the words barely audible over the steady hum of her oxygen concentrator. "He doesn't know anything about Danny or Jonas or any of it. He just wanted to make his dying mother happy." Ford nodded slowly, and Margaret could see him processing this information, filing it away. She realized with growing dread that he was thinking like someone who understood how dangerous secrets worked, how they spread and infected everyone they touched. "Good," he said simply. "We need to keep it that way." Margaret closed her eyes, remembering David at 12 years old, practicing card tricks at her kitchen table while she reviewed stunt safety reports. His small hands fumbling with the deck, his face scrunched in concentration as he tried to perfect a simple sleight of hand. She'd taught him that magic was just misdirection, making people look where you wanted them to look instead of where the real action was happening. Now she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake, if by telling Ford the truth, she'd accidentally made David part of the trick. "He visits every day," she said, opening her eyes to find Ford watching her intently. "Brings me those terrible protein smoothies from the health food store near his apartment. Sits in that chair and grades papers while I sleep." She gestured weakly toward the vinyl chair where Ford had been sitting moments earlier. "He's all I have left." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Margaret's ex-husband had remarried and moved to Phoenix years ago. Her parents were long dead. Her sister lived in Vancouver and called twice a month out of duty rather than affection. David was her world, the only person who would truly mourn her passing, and now she'd potentially put him in the crosshairs of people who had killed to protect their secrets before. Ford sat back down in David's chair, and something about the gesture felt almost intimate, as if he was stepping into her son's place in this strange new reality they'd created together. "Margaret, I need you to understand something. When Danny died, I was nobody, a carpenter who'd done a few bit parts, grateful for any work I could get. I didn't ask questions about what happened because I was too busy trying not to screw up the opportunity I'd been given." His voice carried a weight she recognized, the burden of survivor's guilt mixed with decades of wondering what might have been different if he'd spoken up. She'd carried something similar herself, the knowledge that she'd been too young, too scared, too eager to protect her own budding career to come forward about what she'd witnessed. "I know," she said. "That's why I never blamed you for what happened after. You were innocent." "But I'm not innocent now," Ford replied, his words careful and measured. "If what you're telling me is true, then I've been living Danny Morrison's life for 40 years. His career, his success, his legacy, all of it should have been his." Through the thin walls, Margaret could hear Mrs. Patterson in the next room arguing with her daughter about her will again. The same circular conversation they'd been having for weeks. Normal family drama, the kind that felt almost quaint compared to what she and Ford were discussing. She thought about David coming by in an hour with dinner from her favorite Thai restaurant, how his face would light up when he saw that Harrison Ford had actually shown up, how proud he'd be that his little viral video had worked. "He'll be here soon," she said, though whether it was a warning or a plea, she wasn't sure. Ford checked his watch and stood up. "Then we need to figure out how to protect him." Margaret was about to respond when Ford's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet hospice atmosphere like a blade. Ford glanced at the screen, and his face went from concerned to genuinely frightened in the span of a heartbeat. "Unknown number," he said, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't really unknown at all. "Don't answer it," Margaret whispered, though she couldn't say why every instinct in her body was screaming danger. Ford stared at the phone for 3 more rings, then let it go to voicemail. The silence that followed felt electric, charged with the kind of tension Margaret remembered from sets where something was about to go very wrong. In the old days, she would have called cut, reset the scene, checked the rigging one more time. Now there was nowhere to reset to. The phone chimed with a voicemail notification. Ford's hand hovered over it for a moment before he hit play, holding the device between them so Margaret could hear. "Harrison." The voice was cultured, older, with the kind of authority that came from decades of having people jump when he spoke. "This is William Hartley. I believe we need to talk. I'm in the lobby of Sunset Manor Hospice. I'll be up shortly." The message ended, leaving them staring at each other in stunned silence. Margaret felt her heart monitor spike, the machines beeping accelerating as panic flooded through her system. William Hartley, the studio executive she just named as part of the cover-up, a man she hadn't seen in over 40 years, was in the building. "How did he know?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the increasingly urgent beeping of her machines. "How did he know you were here?" Ford was already moving, crossing to the window and peering through the blinds at the parking lot below. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "There's a black sedan with 2 men in suits just sitting there. They're watching the entrance." The room suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls closing in like a trap. Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had someone been monitoring her calls, David's phone, the hospice's communications, or had they been watching Harrison Ford, tracking his movements, waiting to see what would happen when Hollywood's most beloved hero came to visit a dying stunt coordinator? "The video," Margaret whispered, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "David's video. It went viral. Millions of views, mentions of my name, my background in stunt coordination. If they were still monitoring mentions of Danny Morrison's case, if they had alerts set up." Ford nodded grimly. They would have seen it. Seen that Margaret Chen, 2nd Unit Coordinator from Temple of Doom, was making a very public dying wish to meet Harrison Ford. He turned from the window, his face grim. "We led them right to you." The irony was devastating. David's loving attempt to grant his mother's final wish had inadvertently sent up a flare to the very people who had spent 4 decades ensuring Danny Morrison's death remained buried. Margaret thought about all the innocent comments on the video, fans sharing stories about Ford's films, people offering prayers and well wishes, families sharing their own stories of dying relatives. None of them had any idea they were participating in something that could get people killed. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, measured and deliberate. Margaret could hear the desk nurse asking someone to sign in, A polite exchange that sounded surreal given what she and Ford both knew was really happening. William Hartley wasn't here for a social call. He was here to clean up a mess that had been contained for 41 years. "My purse," Margaret said suddenly, gesturing frantically toward the small closet where her belongings were stored. "There's a safety deposit box key. Bank of America on Wilshire. Box 347. I kept copies of everything. Photos from the set, call sheets, the original rigging specs that showed the safety line had been tampered with. Insurance records that proved Danny was supposed to be the permanent replacement, not a temporary fill-in." Ford grabbed her purse and found the key, slipping it into his pocket. "Why didn't you ever use this? Why wait until now?" "Because I was a coward," Margaret admitted, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Because I was 24 years old and terrified they'd destroy my career before it started. Because I convinced myself that maybe I'd been wrong about what I saw. Because every year that passed made it harder to come forward, until it felt impossible." The footsteps had stopped outside her door. Margaret could see two shadows beneath the gap, and knew that in a moment her peaceful dying process was about to become something else entirely. She thought about Danny Morrison, whose broken body she'd seen wheeled away from that set 41 years ago, and realized that his ghost had finally caught up with all of them. "Margaret," Ford said quietly, "whatever happens next, remember that your son doesn't know anything. Keep him innocent." The door opened, and her old life officially ended. Two men entered Margaret's room with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to getting their way. The first was tall and silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Even at 70-something, William Hartley carried himself like the studio executive he'd been for 5 decades. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes that missed nothing. The second man was younger, broader, with the kind of build that suggested he hadn't spent his career behind a desk. "Margaret Chen," Hartley said, his voice carrying the same cultured authority they'd heard on the voicemail. "You look exactly the same. A little thinner, perhaps, but then again, we're all getting older." He glanced at Ford with something that might have been amusement. "Harrison. Still playing the hero, I see." Margaret felt Ford tense beside her bed, his hand moving instinctively to rest on her shoulder. The gesture was protective, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers. Whatever history existed between these two men, it ran deeper than a simple business relationship. "Bill," Ford said carefully, his voice stripped of the warmth she'd heard earlier. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I imagine not." Hartley moved further into the room, his companion remaining by the door like a sentry. "Though I have to say, when my people told me you were visiting a dying stunt coordinator who'd worked on Temple of Doom, it certainly piqued my interest. Such a small world, Hollywood. The same names keep coming up, don't they?" Margaret watched the exchange with growing dread. There was a choreography to this confrontation that suggested it had been rehearsed, or at least anticipated. Hartley wasn't surprised to find Ford here. He was surprised to find him here first. "We were just leaving," Ford said, moving toward Margaret's wheelchair. "Weren't we, Margaret?" But Hartley raised a hand, and his companion stepped slightly to the side, blocking the doorway without making it look threatening. Anyone passing in the hallway would see a normal family visit, maybe grown children discussing their parents' care. The illusion was perfect. "Oh, I don't think so," Hartley said mildly. "You see, Margaret and I have some catching up to do. It's been, 41 years since we last spoke? Right after that unfortunate accident with Daniel Morrison. You remember that conversation, don't you, Margaret?" The memory hit Margaret like a physical blow. She was 24 again, sitting in a sterile conference room at the studio, facing a table of executives who'd made it very clear that her future in Hollywood depended on her ability to remember certain details correctly, or more importantly, to forget others. Hartley had been the one to slide the non-disclosure agreement across the table, his voice gentle but firm as he explained how these things worked, how careers were built or destroyed by one's ability to be a team player. "I was young," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I was scared." "You were smart," Hartley corrected. "Smart enough to take the settlement money, smart enough to build a wonderful career, smart enough to keep quiet for 4 decades. What I'm trying to understand is what changed. Why, with death's door literally in front of you, would you suddenly decide to become reckless?" Margaret could see Ford processing this information, realizing that her silence hadn't been just about cowardice. It had been bought and paid for. The studio hadn't just covered up Danny Morrison's murder. They'd systematically silenced everyone who might have talked. She wondered how many other people had sat in similar conference rooms, been offered similar choices between complicity and career suicide. Maybe because dying makes you brave, she said. Maybe because some secrets are too heavy to take to the grave. Hartley's companion shifted slightly, and Margaret caught Ford's sharp intake of breath. Whatever these men were prepared to do, it wasn't going to be limited to conversation. The hospice suddenly felt like the most isolated place in the world, despite being full of staff and visitors. Who would question two well-dressed men visiting a cancer patient? Who would think to look twice at a family conference that went on a little too long? "Harrison," Hartley said, turning his attention back to Ford, "I want you to know that I've always considered you a friend. What happened with Danny Morrison was regrettable, but it created opportunities. Your career, your success, your legacy, all of it grew from that moment. Surely you can appreciate the delicate balance we've maintained all these years." Ford's hand tightened on Margaret's shoulder, and she could feel him making a choice, weighing decades of success against whatever conscience had brought him here in the first place. "The thing is," Hartley continued, his voice still conversational, "that balance is now threatened. And when something threatens the stability we've all worked so hard to maintain, well, adjustments become necessary." Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that they weren't leaving this room alive unless something changed, and changed quickly. The quiet fear she'd been carrying since Ford's phone rang exploded into full panic as she understood that her attempt to find peace before dying had instead delivered them both into the hands of people who'd killed once to protect this secret, and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Margaret's mind raced as she stared at Hartley, but it wasn't fear driving her thoughts now. It was the sudden, devastating clarity of understanding how deep this conspiracy truly ran. The settlement money, her career success, even David's scholarship to USC Film School 15 years ago that had seemed like such an unexpected blessing. How much of her life had been orchestrated by these people? "You've been watching me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "All these years, my son's education, my work assignments, the safety awards I won. None of it was real, was it?" Hartley's smile was almost paternal. "My dear Margaret, it was all real. You earned those accolades. David is genuinely gifted. We simply ensured he had opportunities to flourish. We take care of our family." Ford's grip on her shoulder tightened. "Family," he repeated, and Margaret heard 40 years of realization crashing down in that single word. Jesus Christ, how many of us are there? How many careers did you build on Danny's grave? Success creates success, Harrison. When Temple of Doom became a phenomenon, when you became a star, it validated our investment. Directors wanted to work with you. Producers fought to finance your projects. Everyone prospered. Hartley moved closer to Margaret's bed, and she caught a whiff of expensive cologne that triggered another memory. Him standing over Danny's body on set, already calculating the angles. But prosperity requires maintenance. The companion by the door stepped aside as the hallway nurse passed by, whistling softly. For a moment, Margaret considered screaming, but she thought of David bringing her dinner in 40 minutes, walking into whatever nightmare this was about to become. The silence stretched until the whistling faded. "Danny Morrison wasn't just a stunt double," Margaret whispered, pieces falling into place like a puzzle she'd been avoiding for decades. "He found something, didn't he? Something about the studio, about you personally." Hartley's composure cracked slightly, just a flicker around his eyes. Danny was ambitious. Ambitious people sometimes ask inconvenient questions about funding sources, about certain international CO to production deals that were popular in the early 80s, certain partnerships with organizations that the federal government was taking an increasingly dim view of. Ford stepped back from Margaret's bed, his face gone white. "You were laundering money. The movie was a front." The movie was a legitimate production that happened to solve several financial challenges simultaneously. Hartley's voice carried the tone of a professor explaining a particularly elegant equation. Danny discovered some irregularities in the budget reports. Rather than bringing his concerns to the appropriate department, he decided to conduct his own investigation. Very thorough young man. Very dangerous young man. Margaret felt something cold spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her cancer. The rigging failure wasn't sabotage to kill him. It was meant to look like an accident after you'd already killed him. Danny Morrison died of a heroin overdose in a motel room in Burbank on March 15, 1982, Hartley said matter-of-factly. The body that fell from that building was already dead. The accident simply provided a more palatable explanation for everyone involved. Family, insurance companies, union investigators who might ask uncomfortable questions about why a healthy 28-year-old suddenly developed a drug problem. The room tilted around Margaret as the full scope of the horror became clear. They hadn't just killed Danny. They'd staged an elaborate performance using his corpse, turned his death into theater. She remembered the closed casket funeral, how they'd explained that the fall had been too devastating, how she'd stood there crying for a man who'd already been dead for days. "You made me watch," she breathed. "You made me watch you drop his body. Made me think I was witnessing an accident. You wanted witnesses to the cover story." "We needed believable reactions," Hartley confirmed. "Genuine shock, authentic grief. Method acting, you might say. Everyone performed beautifully." Ford had gone absolutely still beside her, and Margaret could see him calculating distances, exit strategies, possibilities. But Hartley's companion had moved slightly, and now she could see the bulge of a weapon beneath his jacket. This wasn't a confrontation they could win through heroics. "David doesn't know," Ford said suddenly, his voice sharp with desperation. "Whatever you think needs to happen here, he's innocent. He's just a teacher who loves his mother." "David is indeed innocent," Hartley agreed. "And he'll remain that way, provided we can reach an understanding. You see, technology has created some challenges for us. Security cameras, cell phone recordings, social media. The old ways of managing these situations have become complicated." Margaret understood with horrible clarity what he was really saying. In 1982, they could kill someone and stage an accident with relative impunity. Now every visitor had a camera, every hallway had surveillance. Every death would be scrutinized by people with access to forensic techniques that hadn't existed 4 decades ago. They weren't here to kill her and Ford. They were here to recruit them. Margaret stared at Hartley, her mind reeling as fragments of memory suddenly clicked into devastating focus. The careful choreography of her career, the doors that had opened at exactly the right moments, David's inexplicably generous scholarship offers, all of it orchestrated by the same hands that had dropped Danny Morrison's corpse from a building. But it was Ford's face that stopped her cold. He wasn't looking at Hartley with the shock and horror she expected. Instead, his expression held something far worse: recognition, guilty recognition. "You already knew," she whispered, the words falling like stones into the silence. "Harrison, you already knew Danny was dead before the fall." Ford's hand slipped from her shoulder. "Margaret, he was your stunt double," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite the machine's frantic beeping. "You worked with him for months. You would have known if he developed a drug problem. You would have seen the signs. The pieces were assembling themselves with merciless precision. The day of the accident, you weren't even supposed to be on set. You showed up unexpectedly, insisted on watching the stunt sequence. You made sure you had an alibi, witnesses who could testify that Harrison Ford was standing right there when his stunt double tragically fell." Ford's silence was answer enough. 41 years, Margaret breathed. 41 years I've been carrying guilt about not speaking up, thinking I was protecting myself and my career. But I wasn't the only witness you needed, was I? You needed Harrison Ford to see it too, to sell the story, to be the grieving star who lost his brave stunt double, because who would ever suspect America's hero of being complicit in murder? Hartley was watching this revelation with obvious satisfaction. "You see, Margaret, this is exactly the kind of analytical thinking that made you such a valuable member of our family." Yes, Harrison was briefed on the situation beforehand. Danny Morrison had become a liability that threatened not just our production, but several highly sensitive business relationships. Harrison understood the bigger picture. Margaret felt something inside her chest crack open. Not the cancer, but something deeper. The faith she'd held onto through her darkest moments, the belief that heroes existed, that some people stood for something pure and good in the world. All those films, she whispered. All those characters fighting for justice, standing up to corruption, and it was all built on a lie. Ford finally spoke, his voice hollow. Danny wasn't innocent, Margaret. He was blackmailing them. He'd gathered evidence about the money laundering and was threatening to go to the FBI unless they paid him $2 million. He was going to destroy the production, cost hundreds of people their jobs. So you killed him, Margaret finished. The great Harrison Ford, defender of justice, helped murder a man for threatening to expose the truth. We saved him from himself, Ford said desperately. Danny was spiraling, making reckless demands. If he'd gone to the authorities, he would have brought down legitimate people along with the guilty ones. The investigation would have destroyed innocent careers, ruined families. Sometimes the greater good requires... The greater good? Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. You mean your career, your stardom, your legacy as America's conscience. She turned her head to face him fully, seeing him clearly for the first time. How long have you been their puppet, Harrison? Since the beginning? Or did they recruit you after Danny started asking questions? Hartley stepped forward, clearly enjoying the destruction of Margaret's illusions. Harrison came to us, actually. Danny had approached him first, tried to get him to join his crusade for transparency. Harrison was wise enough to understand the consequences. He helped us arrange the final meeting with Danny, ensured the young man would be in the right location at the right time. The betrayal was complete now, and Margaret felt a strange kind of peace settling over her. The hero she'd dreamed of meeting didn't exist, had never existed. The man standing beside her bed was just another actor, playing the role of Harrison Ford so convincingly that he'd fooled the world for 4 decades. You know what's beautiful about this? Hartley continued, his arrogance finally showing through the polished facade. Even now, dying of cancer, discovering that your greatest hero is a fraud, you still can't bring yourself to hate him completely. Because the characters he played meant something to you. Because people need their myths more than they need the truth. But Hartley was wrong. Looking at Ford's guilt-stricken face, Margaret realized she felt something she'd never expected: pity. He'd sold his soul so young, so completely, that he'd probably forgotten he'd ever had one. The real tragedy wasn't that Harrison Ford was a killer. It was that he'd been playing the role of a good man for so long he'd convinced himself it was real. You're right about one thing, Margaret said quietly. People do need their myths. But you forgot something important, Bill. She smiled as his confident expression faltered. I'm not people. I'm a dying woman with nothing left to lose, and I've spent my whole life making sure the heroes survived their stunts. Ford stepped back, finally understanding what she was really saying. She hadn't been just a witness to Danny Morrison's staged death. She'd been the rigging coordinator. The silence that followed Margaret's revelation stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Hartley's composed facade cracked completely, while Ford's face drained of what little color remained. The companion by the door shifted forward, hand moving beneath his jacket, but Hartley raised a restraining finger. You're lying, Hartley said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time. The rigging coordinator was Paul Brennan. He signed off on all the safety equipment, filed the incident reports. Paul was the department head, Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength as she watched their carefully constructed narrative begin to crumble. But I was the one who actually rigged the safety lines. 24 years old, eager to prove myself, desperate to show I belonged in a man's world. When you told me Danny's body needed to fall in a specific way to sell the accident, I thought you were talking about staging a realistic stunt. Ford was backing toward the wall, shaking his head. No, you can't have. You didn't know what we were planning. You couldn't have. Margaret's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Of course I knew, Harrison. You think I couldn't tell the difference between rigging safety equipment and rigging a death drop? I spent 3 days calculating the exact trajectory needed to ensure maximum trauma, to make certain Danny's body would be too damaged for a proper autopsy. You needed the fall to explain injuries that were already there, to mask evidence of the overdose. The heart monitor's beeping accelerated as Margaret's pulse spiked, but she pushed through the pain driven by 41 years of suppressed guilt and rage. You want to know what really happened to your stunt double in 1982? I helped you murder him, and then I helped you cover it up so thoroughly that even you convinced yourselves it was justice. Hartley's companion took another step forward, but Margaret was beyond caring about weapons or threats. The truth was finally pouring out of her like poison from a wound, and she couldn't stop it now if she tried. But here's what you never understood, she continued, her eyes locked on Ford's horrified face. The rigging equipment I used that day, I kept it. Every cable, every bolt, every piece of hardware that sent Danny Morrison to his death. It's all sitting in a storage unit in Glendale, along with the real safety specifications and the modified ones I created for your little performance. Ford slumped against the wall. Jesus Christ, Margaret. Why? Why would you keep evidence of insurance? She said simply. I was 24, not stupid. I knew I was involving myself in something that could destroy my life, so I documented everything. The original rigging plans, the modifications you requested, the payments that showed up in my account afterward. I even recorded the conversation where Paul Brennan explained how the Studio S investigation would be conducted, how certain findings would be overlooked. Hartley had gone very still, his mind clearly racing through the implications. You've been sitting on evidence of murder for 4 decades. Evidence of conspiracy, Margaret corrected. Evidence that would implicate not just Harrison, but everyone who participated in the cover-up. Studio executives, union officials, LAPD investigators who filed convenient reports. I documented all of it because I knew someday someone would try to make me the scapegoat. The room felt charged now, like the moment before lightning strikes. Margaret could see the calculations happening behind Hartley's eyes, the rapid assessment of damage and exposure. She'd become something far more dangerous than a dying woman with guilty knowledge. She was a dying woman with proof. David doesn't know about the storage unit, she said quietly, answering the question she could see forming. But my lawyer does. He has instructions to open it if anything happens to me or my son. 41 years worth of evidence, all carefully preserved, all thoroughly documented. Enough to bring down everyone who thought they were safe. Ford pushed himself off the wall, moving closer to her bed with something approaching desperation. Margaret, you don't understand what you're threatening. It's not just us. The money we were laundering, it was connected to people who don't leave loose ends. If this comes out, then maybe it's time, Margaret said, cutting him off. Maybe it's time for the truth, Harrison. Maybe it's time for America's favorite hero to face what he really is. She could see something breaking in Ford's face. 40 years of carefully constructed justification finally crumbling. The weight of playing a good man while carrying the knowledge of murder, the constant fear of exposure, the slow erosion of whatever conscience he'd once possessed, it was all there in his eyes now, naked and desperate. Hartley stepped forward, his composure returning as he processed this new information. You're dying, Margaret. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Even if you expose everything, you won't live to see the consequences. Is revenge really worth destroying your son's future? But Margaret smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced in decades, the absolute certainty that she was finally, after 41 years of silence, doing the right thing. This isn't about revenge, Bill, she said softly. This is about making sure the last thing I do in this world actually matters. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before kings. Margaret watched as her declaration rippled through the room, shattering the careful balance of power that had held for 4 decades. But it was David's voice from the doorway that changed everything. Mom? Everyone turned toward the entrance where David Chen stood frozen, a bag of takeout dinner in one hand and his phone in the other. His face carried the particular confusion of a man who had walked into the middle of a conversation that seemed to concern his mother's death in ways he couldn't comprehend. David! Margaret's voice cracked with a mother's protective instinct, even as she realized her son had just walked into the culmination of her life's greatest mistake. You're early. I brought Thai food from that place you like. David said slowly, his engineer's mind clearly processing the tension in the room, the way Harrison Ford stood pressed against the wall like a cornered animal, the strange man in the expensive suit whose presence radiated menace. Should I come back later? Hartley's companion moved with practiced efficiency, stepping behind David and closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. David's eyes widened as he finally understood that this wasn't a conversation he could simply excuse himself from. "Mr. Chen," Hartley said smoothly, his composure returning as he assessed this new variable. "How wonderful to meet Margaret's devoted son. She speaks of you constantly." Margaret saw David's face change as he registered the implicit threat in Hartley's tone. Her son was many things, brilliant, kind, naive about the darker corners of the world, but he wasn't stupid. The dynamics in the room were clear enough even without context. "What's going on here?" David asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. He looked directly at Ford, and Margaret felt her heart break a little as she saw the last traces of starstruck wonder fade from her son's face. "Mr. Ford, my mother wanted to meet you because your films meant something to her. If this is some kind of shakedown—" "It's not," Margaret said quickly. "David, listen to me very carefully. I need you to understand something about your mother, about who I really was before you were born." Ford stepped forward desperately. "Margaret, don't do this to him. He doesn't need to carry this weight." 41 years ago, Margaret continued, her eyes locked on David's face, I helped kill a man named Danny Morrison. I rigged the safety equipment that dropped his dead body from a building, and I made it look like an accident. I took money for it, and I kept quiet about it, and I've been living with that guilt every single day since." The takeout bag slipped from David's fingers, containers scattering across the floor with soft thuds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Margaret watched her son's face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally a kind of analytical assessment that reminded her painfully of herself at his age. "The storage unit in Glendale," David said quietly. "The one you've been paying for since before I was born. You always said it was just old work equipment." "It is old work equipment," Margaret confirmed. "Equipment that proves Harrison Ford and William Hartley murdered Danny Morrison in 1982. Hartley's mask finally slipped completely. "You stupid, sentimental woman. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Your son was safe as long as he was ignorant. Now—" But David was already moving, his phone sliding from his pocket with the fluid motion of someone who had grown up in the digital age. "Mom, how long have you known they were coming here?" Margaret felt a surge of fierce pride as she watched her son's quick thinking cut through the emotional chaos. "About an hour. Then you've had time to prepare." David's fingers were flying across his phone screen. "The question is, did you?" Ford lunged forward, but David stepped smoothly aside, his attention never leaving his device. "You might want to know," David said conversationally, "that everything that's happened in this room for the last 10 minutes has been broadcast live to my secure server, audio and video. My phone's been recording since I heard raised voices through the door." Hartley went white. "You're bluffing." "I'm an IT security specialist," David replied calmly. "Bluffing about technology isn't really in my skill set." He looked up from his phone, and Margaret saw something in her son's eyes that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. A hardness that came from learning that the world was far more corrupt than he'd imagined. "The storage unit code, Mom. Text it to me now." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her own phone, but not from fear, from pride. Her son had inherited more than just her analytical mind. He'd inherited her instinct for survival, her understanding that in a world full of predators, sometimes you had to bite first. "David," she whispered as she sent the message, "I'm so sorry you had to learn about this." But David was already forwarding the storage unit information to multiple contacts, creating redundancies that would make suppression impossible. "Don't apologize, Mom," he said softly. "You kept evidence for 41 years because you knew someday the truth would matter." He looked at Ford, and Margaret saw her son's childhood hero finally, completely die. Today's that day. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of Los Angeles traffic filtering through the hospice windows. Margaret watched her son complete the final upload, his fingers steady despite having just learned that his dying mother was a killer. In that moment, she saw the last of his innocence disappear, replaced by something harder and more realistic, the understanding that heroes were myths and monsters wore familiar faces. Hartley's companion reached for his weapon, but David held up his phone like a shield. 17 different servers across 4 countries. Even I can't stop it now. His voice carried a quiet finality that reminded Margaret of herself at his age, back when she thought she could control the consequences of her choices. Ford slumped into the visitor's chair, his famous face collapsing into lines of defeat and exhaustion. 40 years, he whispered. 40 years of living with this, and it ends because a dying woman wanted to meet her hero. It ends because you're a murderer, Harrison, Margaret said gently, surprised to find that her anger had transformed into something closer to pity. It was always going to end. I just decided when. Hartley was frantically making calls, but Margaret could see the futility in his movements. The digital age had changed everything about secrets and power. What once required investigative journalists and brave whistleblowers could now be accomplished with a smartphone and an understanding of cloud storage. Her son had weaponized the modern world against men who still thought in terms of controlled narratives and buried evidence. "Mom," David said, moving closer to her bed. His voice carried a tremor now that the adrenaline was fading. "All those years, all those films we watched together. Did you know? When we were watching Raiders, when I was 10 and you made popcorn and we stayed up late, did you know what he really was?" Margaret reached for his hand, feeling how cold his fingers had become. "I knew, but you were so happy, so excited about the adventure and the heroism, and I thought—" She paused, struggling to find words that could encompass 4 decades of self-deception. "I thought maybe if enough people believed in the character, it might somehow make the man more real, like faith could retroactively create virtue." Ford looked up at that, his eyes wet with something that might have been gratitude or grief. "I tried to be him, Margaret. After Danny died, I tried so hard to become the man everyone thought I was, but every role, every interview, every time someone called me a hero, it just made the lie heavier." "Then why didn't you confess?" David asked, his engineer's mind still seeking logical solutions to emotional problems. "Why carry it for so long?" "Because by the time I realized what I'd become," Ford said, "too many other people's lives were built on the lie. My family, my career, the dreams of millions of fans who needed to believe in something pure. How do you destroy all of that for the sake of honesty?" Margaret felt the morphine pulling at the edges of her consciousness, but she fought to stay present for these final moments of truth. "You destroy it," she said softly, "because living a lie isn't really living at all. It's just a very elaborate form of death." Through the window, she could see the Los Angeles skyline stretching toward the Pacific, the city where she'd built her career and raised her son, and learned that the difference between heroes and villains was often just a matter of perspective. Soon, the media would descend like locusts. The evidence would be examined, analyzed, dissected across every platform and network. Harrison Ford's career would end in scandal. 40 years of beloved performances tainted by the knowledge of what lay beneath them. But as Margaret watched her son process this new reality, the understanding that the world was more complex and darker than he'd imagined, but that truth still mattered enough to fight for, she felt something she hadn't experienced since 1982, peace. "David," she whispered, squeezing his hand with what little strength remained, "I need you to promise me something. Anything, Mom. When this story breaks, when they interview you, when they ask you about your mother, remember that people need heroes. They just need real ones this time, flawed ones, human ones, people who make mistakes but find the courage to make them right." David nodded, tears finally coming as he understood that they were saying goodbye not just to each other, but to the simpler world they'd shared before this day. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, and Margaret smiled as she closed her eyes. For the first time in 41 years, she was simply a mother who had loved her son enough to give him the truth, however painful it might be. The last thing she heard was David's voice, steady and strong. "I promise, Mom, I promise."